I figured we would start this afternoon to end this session by going back to the beginning. So I wanted to open up a Bible here to the Genesis chapter 1 and just read and then look into how this might affect how we think about real estate investing. So it's a verse you may be familiar with, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I think most of us have probably heard that before. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What most of us have probably not ever looked into is the Hebrew behind that verse, because believe it or not, it was not written in English. So in the original Hebrew that it was written in, the word create is bara. So I don't know how to spell it in the Hebrew alphabet, but this is how it translates in English, is bara. What bara means in the terms of this verse of creating is creation from nothing. So something that didn't previously exist now exists. So like 0 to 1 entrepreneurship. You're not just taking something existing and making it cooler, or taking a bunch of ingredients that are already there and rearranging them to make something new, but you were starting with some raw ingredients. Bara implies creation out of nothing. So it's very intentional that if you read that verse in the original Hebrew, they use the word bara. The other variation in Hebrew, I believe I'm spelling this right, is asa. And the closest English translation, Hebrew is a way more nuanced language than English is. Like there's way more complexities and like depth and layers of meaning than English, but asa would be make. So this would be create, and this roughly translates as make. So they kind of mean the same thing. We're like, oh, I made something or I created something. But in this context, the writer uses bara because it's implied that you made something from scratch that did not previously exist, okay? This means you made something, but you didn't create something. More on that later. So when we start thinking about small towns versus big cities, most of what we've been talking about this week is like the really tactical, granular level. Hey, if you're investing in this building, here's the cost you need to think about, hiring an A&E firm. Here's what you need to think about from a tax accounting perspective. Here's what the ROI might be. Here's what the cash flows could be. And we've been really zoomed in, which is exactly what I wanted this weekend, so you could feel like you learned the specifics. I feel like we got a lot of inspiration in Naples and learning what Jason's doing. You guys came here to learn the specifics, trying to get as ground level as possible. I want to zoom way back out now and look at big picture trends, because I think once you can get into my brain a little bit here of how I'm thinking about this, you'll probably be even more excited about what Jason and the Small Nation team taught you guys this week, because you'll learn that you have the wind in your sails. So most people today in the United States, and actually the number according to Gallup that I most recently saw, I'll write it right here, is 80% live in a big city. So 80% live in a major metro area. We take that for granted that most of America lives in a big city. Way back when America was founded, like July 4th, 1776, 90% plus people lived in rural agrarian areas. Like over 90% of the population was a farmer, right? So it's completely done a flip in the last 250 years or so, right? We take it for granted though. That's my main point, that it was not always this way. If you go back in time far enough, like pre-feudal ages, most people lived in the middle of nowhere. They worked the land for a lord, and in exchange they got a little straw hut that they could live in, and the Lord promised to protect them from invading armies, right? Most people were like subsistence farmers, and they lived in rural areas. Cities, again, it was the opposite. Hardly anyone lived in cities. And so for about 1,000 years, approximately, from the year 1000 to basically where we are now, the trend was moving from rural to urban, right? What changed this is, I'll just put 1440s. We don't know the exact date because they didn't have, how can I write here, 1440s. We don't know the exact date, but that's when Gutenberg invented the printing press in Europe. It had existed for centuries longer in China, to give them a shout out, but they walled themselves off from the rest of the world, so we didn't discover that until like thousands of years later. So technically the Chinese invented it, but for our purposes, the printing press, spawned modern civilization, and it was the first example of a modern technology that severed the link between geography, time, and distance. So we don't think about it this way, but if you wanted to learn from marketing guru Tim, and Tim lived in Naples, Florida, you would have to go to Naples to learn from him. Like when we go back to the Bible, right? It's why it was such a radical concept for Jesus to say, drop your fishing nets and follow me. And it's like, well, can't I just like subscribe to SMS texts from you and you send me out some tips and a Bible devotional every now and then, right? We take for granted that if you wanted to learn from someone, get information from someone, you had to be physically proximate to them, right? So there is this very real link between geography, information, time, and distance. The printing press is the first example of a technology that began to weaken or sever that link, right? And the printing press led to the Renaissance of 1500s, 1600s, world exploration. It really sparked the modern age, okay? After the printing press, the next major thing that I would say really severed that link is, this is not to scale, but I'm gonna say it's 1861. Company you may have heard of, Western Union, invented the telegraph. Again, it meant that for information to cross from New York to San Francisco no longer took weeks or actually months, it was instantaneous. This was an absolute game changer because it meant if something happened or a new development of finding out that the crop had failed somewhere, you could immediately wire it across the country and everyone knew so they could react faster. So the economy basically increased its velocity because information traveled faster, right? Like this was a huge deal. So the Civil War, part of the reason it was so bloody and so many people died wasn't just the weapons technology, it was that information could travel much faster. So if a spy saw, hey, Lee's moving his army north to Gettysburg, the Union could react instantly because of telegraph lines. We had never had that before. So in the War of 1812, the whole Battle of New Orleans with Andrew Jackson was fought like weeks after the British had already surrendered because we didn't have that technology. Like we take it for granted, like a fish doesn't know what water is, but back then there was this link between time, distance, geography that we completely take for granted today. So printing press, the telegraph, the next major piece that, again, most of us take this for granted because there's not a ton of really old people in here. But 1956, does anyone know why that date is significant in American history?
Television?
Close. The Eisenhower...
Interstate system.
Thank you, Andrew. The Eisenhower interstate system. We completely take this for granted, but this is actually one of the biggest technological developments in world history because it connected all these small towns with these big cities, and partially for the first time, where you were born was not your identity anymore because you were connected to the rest of the country, right? If you look at actually a map of the United States before the interstate system of where people lived, if it was a shaded in a map on population, almost everyone lived in Eastern time zone. And it's still actually that way to this day. If you look at a map, it's why most sports games are played in Eastern time zone. That's where 80% of the population lives. So we still see the artifacts of that. But back then it was like, I don't know the number, it was probably 99%, right? Lived on the eastern seaboard. The interstate system connected the country in a way it was never connected before. But in that process, right, if you've seen the movie Cars, it devastated small towns because what they did is they started building bypasses around small towns so that it incentivized people to move here. So in my hometown, this is one of those examples, we used to have a thriving Main Street area where there was like a downtown with, like Jason said, JCPenney's, lots of retail, shopping, like the Puritan Cafe where my grandpa used to go for business meetings with the other business people all the time. None of those places exist anymore because they just thought, oh, well, it's more convenient if we reroute Highway 12 around downtown Wilmer, and now no one has to drive through it anymore. And pretty much overnight, the downtown died, right? Because there's no traffic flow there anymore. Alison Werder's boutique is in an even smaller town, New London, that's 10 times smaller than Wilmer is, but they have a thriving downtown Main Street. The main reason is that there's still a main road, is it Highway 9? 9 goes through New London. So they still have traffic flow. They didn't build a bypass. So in the process of building the Eisenhower interstate system, they basically gutted America's main streets and created a huge incentive to move to a big city because it made it easier to drive faster to get between these cities, right? It wasn't such a big lifestyle decision of, oh, I'm gonna go to a big city because I can drive 80 miles an hour and get there now. You're not taking, like, no one takes Route 66 anymore to get to Southern California, right? You take the big interstates or you fly. The other question that's interesting to me when I look at some of these dates is if you ask anyone, what was the golden age of just America, like the good old days, right? Like Norman Rockwell painting, good old America, small town, they will say the 1950s. It's like, interesting. What happened in the 50s that changed that, right? Some people might say the 60s, but this actually took 40 years to be fully completed. You know, they were building interstates for decades because it was such a massive project. But it was the interstate system that really changed this like Americana feeling of the golden age of a main street where it's walkable, you go to restaurants, right? What Jason is describing, we used to have, is what I'm saying, right? It's nothing new. We used to have it and we abandoned it. So this entire trend here is really a trend of centralization. People concentrating in a big city. This is my drawing of like a pro sports stadium. This is a really tall building that has the antennas to try to like, hey, look, we're taller than other buildings. And 80% of America lives there now because of the trend of centralization. When did malls come in? 1970s, right about here. What is a mall? It's centralizing all the main street businesses and putting them in one place. A mall is the city of retail, right? So the macro trend happening in American society for most of the last 100 years is all centralization. Now, why would anyone want to live in a big city? Like, what's the one word reason you move to a city? Jobs, right? The second reason that a millennial might give of why they want to move to a city is things to do, right? We have taken this for granted our entire lives that the cities have the jobs. It's just, duh, it's a fact of life, right? Of course, that's where all the jobs are. But let me ask you a question. What would happen if that were no longer true? What would happen if a technology were invented, perhaps, that severed the link between where you have to live and where you can work? What would that look like? You'd be in a fish out of water. You never realize that we've thought our whole lives that cities are where the jobs are, right? And that's why people moved to the cities throughout this process. Is, you know, in the Industrial Revolution, they wanted to get off the farms where they were basically subsistence farming / starving, you know, and they would rather have a job in the city because as awful as those jobs were in the Industrial Revolution, it still paid more and you were less likely to die than living out in the middle of nowhere subsistence farming, right? So yeah, it might have been poor working conditions compared to what we think of now, but the reason they moved to the cities is that it was better than where they were coming from, right? They moved for jobs. Now, if you take that away, cities have things to do, but would you rather live in a city if you could have a high-paying job or live in a small town, such as Bellefontaine, for example, and make big city money? So what we're about to see is the reverse trend that we've been seeing for the last 100 years, and this is like a big deal of moving from here back to here. So it's really a trend of decentralization, and that's obviously a buzzword right now with crypto and, you know, everything going on in tech of decentralizing tech. But this is a huge, huge deal. It's like the opportunity to get ahead of a trend before the rest of the world sees it coming. So this is a Gallup poll. That's where I got this. 80% of people currently live in cities. What if I told you that 40% of people don't want to? They would rather live in a small town or a rural area. Again, Gallup poll, 40%. Not 5 or 10 or 12. 40% of people, if they had the choice, would live in a rural area or a small town. That's tens, actually it's like 100 million plus people, if you look at the American population, if given the choice, would move out of a big city if it became possible. Now, what technology, in a word, is driving this trend? The internet, right? The internet makes it possible to have a remote job. The internet's been around, obviously, for 25 years, but the difference is that speeds are now fast enough that you can actually work from home and do a good job. It's not dial-up internet anymore, right? Like the concept of Netflix really took off, not when they invented, hey, we'll mail you DVDs, but when speeds got fast enough to stream HD video, right? So social trends in large part are driven by tech trends, and sometimes it creates like a reinforcing relationship, where tech trends are driving people to move to a city. So working remote is a big deal. And I think most of us take it for granted because we all worked remote, right? But the really crazy thing is that this stat came out before COVID. So I don't know what this number is now. But imagine being locked in your condo in New York City or in San Francisco or in Minneapolis or Columbus. Do you think it's only 40%? It's 40% plus, right? That's a 2019 stat, is 40% of people, if given the choice, would move to a small town. Now, the problem is when you think of small towns, they don't have jobs. That's why people don't move to them. And they also don't have things to do relative to a big city. But again, tech comes to the rescue. There's a company now called Jetson, named after like the show The Jetsons, that's building mini personal helicopters. There's Tim in his mini personal helicopter that are $90,000, that are fully electric rechargeable, don't have to have a pilot's license, the computer flies it for you. It's designed to park in a standard parking spot. So it operates like a Harrier where it takes up vertically, and you can park it in a standard parking spot. So if Tim wants to live in Bellefontaine, but Tim's a hockey fan and wants to see like the Blue Jackets play when they have home games in Columbus, he can take his Jetson, fly there, get there in probably 30 to 45 minutes, watch the game, and then fly back, and it's flying itself. I don't have to have a pilot's license. I just hit a button, I key it in, and it takes me there, right? Right now, these are $92,000. So that's without economy of scale, without like people really starting to buy them and take on, accelerate, I guess, the cash for R&D and for scaling. More than likely, something like this will cost $50,000 within the next 5 to 10 years. So it'll become within the reach of like an upper middle class person. Let me just lay this out as specifically as possible so you can get to like think concretely about this versus just big picture stuff. You could live in Bellefontaine, have a Jetson or whatever other brands come out in the future, fly to Columbus while you're working, watching a movie, doing whatever, and it's flying so you're not stuck in traffic. It's a technology that severs the link between geography, time, and distance, right? How many of this 40% plus, if they had access to something like this, be like, oh, cool, that's it, I'm moving to Bellefontaine. Or I'm moving to insert name of small town because I can have all the benefits of a big city without all the things I hate about the big city. Remember, this was before COVID, right? So what are small towns lacking? Jobs doesn't really become an issue anymore because my market is the world if I have the internet as a distribution platform, right? Like, doesn't matter where Tim lives. He can operate platform from Naples or Antarctica or Minnesota. It doesn't matter, right? So jobs aren't really that big of a deal. The reason right now, the only thing holding back an explosion of small towns is number 2, things to do. And that's where I see huge economic opportunity, is that this is where it gets back to Bara versus Asa. We have the opportunity to create businesses that give people entertainment, places to shop, places to eat, things to do in small towns, and get ahead of this trend before the rest of culture realizes that this is where things are going. Because if you've seen the success of 600 downtown in Bellefontaine, or you've seen the success of Flying Pepper, like, you can't be like, oh, okay, cool, I've seen a pizza place work, I'm gonna open up another gourmet pizza place in Bellefontaine. It's like, well, probably wouldn't support another one just like it. Like, you had to get there first, right? But most of us know small towns. I was just talking to Allison before this, where it's like, there's latent demand, there's people with money there, and they're driving an hour away. I don't think Jason went into much detail here, but the reason that he had the idea for a pizza place originally was the owner who originally started 600 had places like in Columbus, and Jason kept peppering them like, you've got to open up a branch in Bellefontaine. You've got to open up a branch in Bellefontaine. He's like, no, no, no. And for years this went on. And eventually Jason was there on a Friday night, and he's like, he pointed out half the dining room, and he's like, you know, this person, that person, that person, that person, they're all from Logan County. They drove here an hour away to eat pizza. People from my town are driving an hour away. If you brought it to them, there's already demand there, right? If you put a thing to do, there's money of people who want to support it, right? So we're in this kind of like in-between time right now where the trend has already started, right? Because this is not Tim's theory that, oh, I think some people might start working remotely, right? It's already a thing, and yet it's not widely distributed yet. There's still tons of companies that are experimenting with it. You know, maybe, like my mom's an accountant and still goes to work today. That's every day. That's insane. Why would an accountant have to go to an office? That's insane, right? Most of you obviously are realtors. You don't even think about like, oh, why, like my brokerage needs an expensive office somewhere that I go to. It's just like, well, that's stupid, right? Most of the economy hasn't caught on to that yet. Most of the legacy economy is still stuck in old business models. If we have to go to an office, our employees have to work in a specific geographic area. And once the rest of the world catches up, this is a huge, huge trend. The only reason towns like, you know, Willmar, Candiota County, or Hutchinson in Minnesota, or wherever your small towns are that you're passionate about, and, you know, Boise, it might be Kuna, right? Like Meridian's too cool, too popular, too growing. Kuna, though, is half hour away from everything else, and it's still very much a small town. Or where Heather is, like Hondo. San Antonio is a big community. Hondo is the Bellefontaine of South Texas, right? It's a small town where the nearest big city is an hour away, and right now there's not enough stuff to do, but there's natural beauty, low cost of living, right? That even if the economy contracts, if someone can move somewhere with high housing prices, that they can buy a house for $250,000, $300,000, they're shocked because they're used to coming from a city where that same house costs $500 or $600, right? There are all these trends that you basically can't argue with me. It's already happening, but the reason it's not really blowing up yet, Bellefontaine style, is that Bellefontaine had an entrepreneur who barraged when everyone else was kind of just like, oh, it'll never work there, right? It'll never work. So it takes someone willing to create something from nothing. And this is why we can't rely on chambers of commerce. We can't rely on city economic development, you know, or government agencies, because all politicians do at the end of the day is ASA. The best case scenario, if they're not like actively destroying value, is they're just moving stuff around, right? They're taxing one group and spending that tax money somewhere else. Best case scenario, it's a zero-sum game. So all politics can do is ASA. Entrepreneurship is bara. You're taking something that didn't previously exist. It's 0 to 1 business growth, right? There was not a gourmet pizza place in Bellefontaine, and Jason's like, it could work here. We've got to get one here. There's the money here. Like, it should work. I don't have proof, but I feel it's going to work, and it did. And now that business brings in $2 million a year, 30% profit margin, $600,000 a year net profit. He owns half of it. So I don't know if you guys were doing this math when Jason's talking about this, but Jason personally makes $300,000 a year from 600 downtown. He personally, like just his share of the profits of 600 downtown is $25,000 a month. Plus rents. Right? Like, he's making more from a pizzeria than many of you are making your entire real estate business that you're working 50, 60 hours a week on. Because he's riding this trend of decentralization. That business is only going to increase in the future because he's still early. I feel in this trend right now of decentralization, of the moving to small towns, that we're in like where the internet was in 1997. People are talking about it like, oh, it's peak, but it's like 1997 is so early. We're still early in the internet, right? That's how early we are. That's how early we are in this trend. So when you ASA, I think of it as like it's kind of like in finance what a bond is, right? Where when you take the mentality of bara, it's stocks, it's starting a company. There's risk, it's uncertain, there's ambiguity, there's no promise it's going to work, and it's where all the upside is. So if you take this mentality of thinking, cool, small towns seem to be growing, there seems to be something there, I see something that other people don't see, what do you do next? To me, I start viewing small towns equal an asset class. Usually when we think of asset classes, we think of like, tech, munis, cash instruments, precious metals, growth stocks, cash flow stocks, whatever, right? Real estate, crypto. I'm starting to think of small towns as an asset class in and of itself. It's a bunch of properties that have something in common, but they're not all the same, but they rise and fall with each other, right? So if I was looking to maximize investing returns over the next 10, 25 years, I'd be looking, how can I ride this wave? Because every big company that now is worth billions of dollars, again, we take it for granted like a fish doesn't know what water is, but they were really just big companies because they rode a wave. Like, what do Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Google, all these companies have in common? They just rode the wave of the internet, right? They didn't really know what they were doing for the first 5, 10 years as they were figuring it out. But if you're riding a wave, the wave always subsidizes your lack of knowledge. Because if that's the way things are going, you can figure it out along the way, right? You don't want to go into a dying industry and be the best executor, implementer in a dying industry where you're fighting the tide, right? Like, this is a huge wave and it's just beginning. So you've probably seen platforms start to do this over the last year in case you've had inklings, but if you've noticed, we've put a lot more of an emphasis on small towns in our copy. We're sponsoring a goddamn rodeo this summer, right? Like, that's because I'm trying to put an emphasis on platform is going to help agents that work in smaller towns, because I think that's where all the opportunity is. Cities are always going to do well, by the way. So this is an interesting statistical reality that you see articles that say cities are growing, right? Oh, cities still didn't shrink during COVID lockdowns, right? Cities continue to grow, and they will. Like, this number of 80% is probably not going to change. In 10, 15 years, this will actually probably be 90%. So even though everything I'm saying of this is where all the opportunity is, these things can coexist. And it's because of simple math. So if a city has millions and millions of people, but that city loses a couple thousand people, let's say the city loses 10,000 people, negative 10,000 people, and this small town of Bellefontaine gains 1,500 people, right? We're plus 1,500, negative 10,000 over here. But this city started with millions of people. This is a way bigger deal as a percentage. So this is still where the opportunity is, even if the city, the city might have lost 10,000 people, but 11,000 people moved there, net gain, or I should say 20,000 people moved there, right? So they lost 10,000 people, but it's plus 20,000. So they're still up 10,000, right? So that's why you see these articles of like cities are where all the action is, where all the opportunity is, right? Look, even throughout COVID, the cities are still growing. But what's a bigger deal to a place? A city that already had 1.5 million people adding 10,000, or a city like Bellefontaine that had 15,000 people adding 1,500? That's a 10% increase. For a city to have the same delta, they'd have to add 100,000 people in a year. There's no city that's even close to doing that. So this is where all the action is, even with way smaller numbers. Because if you're in a small town that has 15,000 people, or I would still view a town that has 30 or 40,000 people as a small town, right? That small town adds 2,000 people in a couple years. That completely changes the economics of that small town, because you can't build houses that fast, right? Housing prices increases. Typically, every new person who moves to an area adds 3 to 4 other jobs that have to support it. And the other thing is, not all people moving are created equal, right? It's not a very PC thing. to say, but the type of people that are drawn to move from big city on this like bridge of decentralization and they find their dream rural area or small town somewhere, if that move is being driven by a desire for that pastoral provincial lifestyle of I want a couple acres, I want my kids to be able to grow up and walk around and meet the neighbors and know people and that small town Americana, right? That person probably has a remote job. That's the reason they're making the move. Because remember, we established, like, let's be honest, there aren't jobs in small towns. There's not awesome jobs at places hiring in Bellefontaine. Jason probably disagrees, but there's not compared to Columbus. It's an objective fact that there's more economic opportunity in Columbus, right? You can't argue with that. So the type of people who are making the move are not being driven by jobs. It's because their job is delinked from time and place. They have a remote job. Remote jobs pay more. If you have a remote job, you're probably making $60,000 to $80,000 a year plus. That's just an economic fact, right? There aren't people with remote jobs that are working for $11 an hour, $12 an hour, $15 an hour, right? Remote jobs pay more. So the type of people that are making this move are the exact type of people you would want moving to your community because they're the type of people who have money to spend at the Flying Pepper. They have money to spend buying a $30 pizza and then going out to Witt's Custard and getting dessert afterwards, right? So the people with incomes that are going to grow are the ones moving. That's where all the opportunity is. So just to wrap a bow around this whole week, I want you thinking big picture too, that it's not just interesting ideas of, hey, here's what the tax implications of investing are, right? Or here's what my cash flow calculation is, or here's how much it costs to start a pizzeria. That's all cool, and we have to know that knowledge. But once you realize like the broader trends that are at place, that if you just step back and look at everything happening, give it 10 years, and if you go to some small town and start a kick-ass pizzeria or a co-working space, a coffee shop, right, a Mexican food place. I mean, Jason's going to start, I'm sure, tons of awesome businesses in the next couple of years that we don't even know about yet, right? You can make way more from that opportunity when you ride a cultural wave. It's like pouring gas on a fire, right? Than you can by just thinking about, well, maybe I'll try this. I'll put an Airbnb somewhere. I'll buy a single family home, and maybe after all expenses, I might make $500 a month on it, right? This is a huge, huge trend. And I believe in this so much, like this is where I'm going to be putting my money, is I think that small towns are the future. Even though cities will continue to grow, this is 80%, it'll be 90, right? Cities will continue sucking up most of the population, but small towns are where the actual investment entrepreneurial opportunity is. Even Thomas Jefferson foresaw this 250 years ago, and I don't have the quote memorized, so I'm going to pull it up on my phone quick. So he told this in a letter to James Madison. James Madison was like the architect of the Constitution. He's a huge reason why we have a bicameral legislature with a Senate and a House. And they were debating back and forth. And what Jefferson said was, I think our governments will remain virtuous for many centuries as long as they are chiefly rural and agricultural. And this will be as long as there shall be vacant lands in any part of America. When they get piled upon one another in large cities, as in Europe, they will become corrupt as in Europe. So Thomas Jefferson grew up as like a planter farmer in rural Virginia, right? He saw that if I live in a small town where I know my neighbors and I'm not dependent on people like you are in a big city, people in big cities are dependent on politicians for everything, you naturally are freer, right? You're going to think for yourself more, be more independent minded if you're rural. That's why Jefferson was the president when, I guess it was 20, 25 years later after the Constitution that he was president, and he bought the Louisiana Purchase, because he knew that as long as America was expanding westward and there were rural areas and small towns to expand into, America would stay free and prosperous, versus if we were constrained to a tiny area, and then as you stay in cities, you become more dependent on the politics of that city because the politicians like micromanaging and planning everything, right? So that exchange between Madison and Jefferson is even why we have a Senate now. Because think about what is the purpose of the US Senate or the Electoral College in the context of all this?
To pick your pocket.
It's protecting this, so that this doesn't get violated by this. Because Wyoming, which has no one, still has 2 senators, the same as New York, which has a huge percentage of the population, right? Without Madison and Jefferson focusing on that, like we've got to protect the small towns and rural areas from being bullied by big cities, you wouldn't have a US Senate, you wouldn't have an electoral college where Wyoming can literally cancel out the votes from California or Florida or Minnesota or whatever, right? And everyone agreed at the time that's genius, so even most states have that. Like in most state governments, they have a Senate and a House because they want the same thing, where they don't want, let's say, Columbus telling people what they can and can't do in Bellefontaine. So there's both a Senate and a House in both, both state governments. So even way back when, 250 years ago, Thomas Jefferson called all this, that there is something nice about living in a small town that just can't be recreated in a big city. Recently, researchers, sociologists have developed what's kind of called the Savannah theory of happiness, if anyone's ever heard of that. They've done like big studies. The largest one was like 15,000 people, where they polled people who live in big cities, small towns, and they found that you are objectively happier on all measures of well-being. That even tracks to like heart rate, heart disease, levels of cortisol and all that, living in a small town, in a rural area with regular access to nature. It's just a fact, they can't deny it. They basically call it now the Savannah theory of happiness, that humans are happier when we're closer to nature, not smashed together in a big city. Like if you go on a trip to Chicago, do you go to Chicago for 10 days or do you go to Chicago for a weekend? Most people go to New York City or Las Vegas or Chicago for a weekend because that's about what your brain can take, right? We've maybe never given words to that, but it's like, oh, this is awesome. All right, now I'm ready to go home, right? Because you've had about 2, 3, 4 days, but that's about enough. I'm gonna head home, right? And yet when people take vacations in nature, they typically spend a week, 2 weeks, or August, right? Because like you really relax when you get into a place in nature. I don't know the exact population density. I can grab it for you off the top of my head, but they've done studies that even show where you live in terms of people per square mile, the density determines how you think politically. Like they've narrowed it down to an exact number of if you are from an area that has a population density of humans per square mile less than this, you're gonna go on this side politically, and if you're from an area that's more than that, you'll go this side. So this completely shapes how you experience the world. And I think people, all things being equal, would rather live in a less populated area with more room to run around. So we're even like reimagining what is Platform's brand. We're trying to get more clients in small towns. So that's the way Platform is headed. We know that our marketing works best in those areas, and I think we're riding a wave. So I'm not just saying this because I think it's interesting. It's how I'm betting my entire career in business.
Well, it's also your, clicks per pay, right? So you're getting more value in a small town.
Yeah, because you're, yeah.
Add money than you are in a bigger city, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're in a town of 30,000 people and you have a video that gets 20,000 views, every adult has seen it multiple times because out of 30,000 people, 15,000 are kids. And so that means every adult in the area has seen your video statistically multiple times. If you're on Long Island and you have a video that gets 20,000 views, it's like, cool, you want a cookie? Like there's 4 million people there, right? Like doesn't matter. So we get results better for people if you're in a somewhat small town rural area. Yeah.
Tim, kind of reinforces everything you're saying is one of the reasons that Ohio is like ground zero for presidential elections and that kind of thing is it's one of the few states that has almost an equal number of people who live in cities
Versus rural areas. Yep.
It's almost 50-50.
Yep.
And it's, they stated that the trend is that people always met where the jobs are.
Yep.
And now employers are wanting to go where the people want to live.
Yep.
And,
So if I actually, in the first draft of this presentation, I had a third point, which maybe wasn't super relevant to this talk, but if you have the ability to choose, the third point is natural beauty. All things being equal, if there's some stuff to do, if you have access to the internet for your job, all things being equal, like ceteris paribus, you'd rather live somewhere that has natural beauty. So like if I were thinking about where I'm going to invest, I'd look at like, okay, what is, like Naples is beautiful, but Naples is also not a small town. What has upside that's a beautiful place to live, things to do? It's like Punta Gorda, go a little bit, further north into Portugal. Like, what are those small towns that still have that vibe? They're still beautiful, but they're still upside, right? Or hilly country, like, that has mountains. That's why I bought in Spearfish. Like, again, I'm putting my money where my mouth is. I bought 6 acres in Spearfish last year because it checks all those boxes. It's gorgeous. There's no income tax, and it's still a small town. Spearfish is about like Bellefontaine. Like, that's where all the action is in the future. And so not only can you position yourself as an expert in one of these places as a realtor, because this is where the population is trending, but you can build businesses that can end up actually making you far more than you were in your real estate career if you just have one that does well. Thoughts, disagreements?
The two largest economic development in Ohio history, one was the Maryville Honda plant, which is
Right down the road, yep.
The next is coming is Intel,
Yep.
which will dwarf Honda's investment. Could be $100 billion, and it's my direction from Columbus, which is this direction. But they're
Sure.
all there, and they picked it because of its rural nature, and because of its lifestyle, and the people that are there. They know there's not enough houses. They know there's not enough.
Totally.
But the people will come because they want to live here.
Yep. Most people don't believe reality until they see it. So that's something, if you're taking notes, like, write that down. Most people don't believe reality until they see it. Most people in here probably did not know this existed until I just told you. And it still won't matter until you see one. And it still won't matter until the range increases to 100 miles or more. Because right now you can only go about 30 miles on one of these. But at the rate battery tech is progressing, that'll be 100 miles really soon, and soon it'll be 150. And soon you could live in the absolute middle of nowhere, fly in your jets into a big city whenever you want to go out for a nice sushi dinner, or go to a stand-up comedian that you love, or go see a pro sporting event. And you could essentially have all the benefits, but be close to a city. Because this is something I argue with my friends about all the time, because I'm like the anti-hipster, right? I'm not cool. I drink milk when I go out to eat, right? Like, I'm decidedly not cool. But if I can live somewhere rural, and I basically eliminate the pros and cons list, where it's like, I don't really want to do that, I'd rather just have all the pros, right? I can live somewhere rural. It's like, well, if I want to get sushi and take Bella out for Valentine's Day or her birthday, whatever, just some random date, and go somewhere fancy, or go to a pro sports event if she wants to see a musician she likes, whatever. Like, you're not typically doing that on Tuesday nights or Monday nights, right? This is the argument I always have with my friends. I'm like, why do you live in Minneapolis where you get just like a shit-tastic home for $500,000, where there's drive-bys in your neighborhood all the time? You're like, but I'm close to restaurants. Like, cool, but are you eating out every night? It's like, no, you might on the weekend. Why would you not live here, and then when you want to go out to eat, by all means, just go to the city and then fly back? Like, you can still have that. People aren't willing to drive right now, though. So, like, even just this technology, I think it's going to change the world, and no one's talking about it. Like, Andrew lives on 50 acres on a private lake, on a peninsula, in a log cabin, surrounded by rolling hills, flanked on apple orchards on both sides. He's about to buy, is it a 100-acre parcel that's on the other side of the road?
A few years out, it'll be
75. So, like, he'll increase that to 125 acres. And he's in a rural area, 2 hours away from a major city, and he can afford that in his 20s. And he didn't get like a subsidy from anyone, so it's not like I gave him money or our family gave him money or something. It's just when you live somewhere that's in the middle of nowhere, you can afford that. And he had a remote job, right? So he's actually a leading indicator that proves what I'm talking about, is like, you could live a baller life that maybe multiplies your income by a factor of 10 because you have big city pay living in a small area, but also things are cheaper here. So it's not just one variable, it's two. Right? The cost of living is lower, and you're getting big city pay. Like, a platform, I don't care where like Jackie lives. I'm not going to pay you less if you live in a small town, or more if you live in a big city. So whenever we have employees who live in big cities, I'm like, why? You could live anywhere. Why wouldn't you live somewhere that increases your earning power by $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000 a month? And people just don't yet see it yet, because they don't believe reality until they see it. So until this literally until this costs $30,000 and can go 100 miles, people won't take action ahead of its implementation, I guess. Like, what would you do? Maybe it's easy to look historically. What would you do if in the 1890s you foresaw everything that was going to happen with the automobile? Like, what would you invest in if you saw it a decade or two before everyone else?
Tires.
Land 20 miles away from.
Yeah, because the car completely opened up the country where people started driving, traveling. Like, hotels, motels really didn't exist. They were only a rich person thing when wealthy people would travel, right? Gas stations and fuel stations. And right now, those are about to be decimated because with everything moving electric at some point in the next, I don't think it's going to be in 5 years, but 10, 15 years out, like, there's really no need for convenience store gas stations because most convenience stores sell gas at cost, hoping you go in and buy stuff for your road trip, right? So those might go the way of the past, and who knows what those will be replaced with. I think about all the malls, like as we centralized everything and went away from main streets and we went all in on shopping malls, which is just a centralization of local stores. What are all those malls going to become in the future, right? We're still in this period of time, though, where there's tons of small local main streets that absolutely suck. They're just terrible, and they're cheap, right? Like, everyone knows Warren Buffett. He's super rich, richest investor ever. They think he's this amazing investor, but he really hasn't made any good investments in the last, 20 years. Almost all of his good investments were made 30, 40 years ago, plus. Does anyone know why? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
He doesn't invest in anything that he doesn't understand.
True.
Speed of information.
What's that?
Speed of information.
Kind of. It has to do with information. So yes, compound interest is absolutely true. Like, he's made his money because he just has had time in the market, not timing of the market. But his whole investing philosophy is based on an idea that doesn't work anymore. He learned everything from Benjamin Graham, and the whole philosophy was value investing, right? Which is buy companies or buy stocks that have a low PE ratio, price to earnings. So ideally something in the single digits where you can buy a company that's worth $1 million, but cash flow is $100K a year. So that's a PE of 10, $1 million divided by 10. So in other words, you buy it, you get your money back in 10 years, right? He almost exclusively bought companies that when he looked at their book value, that the PE was really low. But this was back before all this data was centralized. He would personally do research, fly around the country, ask companies, that he was an investor. He's like, I want to look at your books. And then he'd find opportunities of wow, this company no one's ever heard of, and they have a PE of 6. That means in 6 years I get my investment back. And he would go all in on that company buying shares because other investors didn't have access to that information. You actually cannot replicate that strategy today because all financial information is available at the click of a button. You can go on Yahoo Finance and just sort every publicly available stock by PE. So there's no more informational asymmetry. Right? A young Warren Buffett today could not replicate what Warren Buffett did back then because information is completely readily available. So you can't find exceptions, I guess what I'm saying, right? Except this. This is information asymmetry. It's something that the rest of the world has buried their head in the sand and they don't see this, maybe because they don't want to see it, right? This is an actual informational advantage of cool. Heather, you live in, Medina County, Hondo, Texas. You see all this stuff happening already. So you're probably on the tip of the spear in terms of seeing this trend. And there's still no one doing anything. There's not people opening retail restaurants. The way people made money in the gold rush, right, wasn't finding gold, it was selling pickaxes to the people moving out there.
It's crazy to me that nobody's doing anything. I have one neighborhood coming in of 250 houses, another neighborhood coming in 918 houses. I mean, our town is about to double in size in the next
And
5
no one
years.
is starting the
And
retail
nobody's doing
businesses
anything.
that'll
There's
serve all
nowhere
those
for
people.
Nowhere for people to do anything. We don't have, entertainment-wise, we have a movie theater that shows one movie a week, right? And it's usually an open. No bowling in them. I mean, nothing. There's nothing to do. We have HEBs, but axe throwing, all this stuff
Yep.
would work so perfectly.
And so the last thing I'll say here, because I know I've just gave you a bunch of information, but most of you are in a high margin cash flow business, right? Your cost of goods or your expenses are a tiny percentage of your overall business, right? You think of it as oh no, my expenses were 20% of my income last year. It's well, that's an 80% profit margin. That's amazing. Most businesses would kill to have an 80% profit margin, right? If you make 300 grand a year as a realtor, more than likely you spent less than $50,000 in that business, right? So you have a very high margin cash flow driven business. This strategy is more driven, what Jason's doing is more driven by a balance sheet mentality. If I'm not trying to necessarily go out and build businesses that are going to make a ton of cash flow, but I'm optimizing for 10 years from now, if I own the real estate and I own a business that's at least successful enough to pay the expenses, the mortgage and everything, then I'm acquiring the property for free, right? Most people think about buying the property and finding a tenant, but if you own the business that pays it, then the business is building the equity for you, and at some point, the population trend will make that business profitable. So it's still a win if you buy a building, put a business in it, get it going, whether you start a pizza place, co-working shop, whatever, as long as it's paying for itself, the population increase will turn it profitable in the next 5 years. So Jason thinks in 10-year increments. I don't think he ever explicitly said this, but he's optimizing for like what'll maximize my portfolio value and my financial situation 10 years from now. Because if he wasn't doing that, he would not be spending the amount of money he's spending on consulting, branding, pumping the absurd amounts of capital into some of these buildings that he has, because he's not concerned with short-term cash flow. Does it help that he has a pizza business that brings in $600K a year of profit? Yeah, that helps. But now he has a tax problem, so he invests into all these other buildings to shield that income. He doesn't want to show a huge taxable profit, right? Remember, Jason said he hasn't paid taxes in seven years, what it is, something like that? He hasn't paid federal taxes in that long because of all the projects that he's doing. So imagine what Jason will have after getting like a decade head start, really a multi-decade head start in Bellefontaine. I think anyone can do it. You just need to find the small town that ideally has not things to do, maybe has natural beauty, somewhat near a major city that people might want to live, and then look at trends. Are people moving there? Like, look at, are people with remote jobs moving somewhere? If that's happening, then there's huge opportunity there. And ask yourself the question, do people who live there, are they driving more than half an hour to 45 minutes away for dining experiences, shopping, or retail? Because there's a lot of small towns where that's true. Like, there is money in the small town. Like in our tiny, crappy hometown in Minnesota, there's a turkey company called Jennie-O that's $1 billion company, billion with a B, and it's in this tiny town. So all the corporate executives of this $1 billion company, about the size of Bellefontaine, are in this tiny hometown. And yet it's still a hometown that like people will drive an hour away to go to Olive Garden because they're like, this was a nice meal out. Right? Or if they're classy and they're into seafood, it's like Red Lobster is also an hour away. So if people are leaving but they're still spending money elsewhere, those would be the two things. Are people with remote jobs moving there, and are people who are living there spending their money elsewhere? It's like, well, that's a slam dunk then. You know, like that's about as like having your cake and eat it too as you can possibly get, where you're living in the Bara world versus Asa, but there's really not downside to it. So just so everyone understands what opportunity zone is, it's basically like you can put money into buildings if it's in a federally designated opportunity zone, but you don't have to worry about doing a 1031 on the back end because you don't owe taxes on the capital gain appreciation. Where you could still do everything Jason doing, he would do without the opportunity zone, because he would just 1031 it or just never sell. You know. So, cool. Well, thank you guys for coming out, and do it.